So the other day I watched the documentary about Fred Rogers. Does anyone not know who Mr. Rogers was? So this is a show I watched as a child, and it was so different even then than anything that was on television. It was very meditative, actually. He moved very slowly, and he would this whole ritual of changing out of the sport jacket into the sweater and changing his shoes. And the other things I watched at that age were like anvils falling on animals' heads and falling off cliffs, and and it's shocking actually to look back at how violent those cartoons were. And this was a stark contrast because the essential message of Mr. Rogers was be a good neighbor, and he would say things like, "I like you just the way you are." Such beautiful sentiment. I feel like he was an amazing bodhisattva. He did that show for over 40 years, and in addition to these kind of simple messages of encouragement, he tackled major things like the assassination of Robert Kennedy. They talked about in a way that kids could kind of understand that, and at a time where the civil rights movement was in full force and effect, he had one of the characters. There's a beautiful scene that in the documentary of this black man who's one of the characters, and Mr. Rogers is in his backyard soaking his feet in a little swimming pool, like an inflatable swimming pool, and he invites the black gentleman to put his feet in the pool. Right at the time, there were all these arguments about who could swim where, and it's so beautiful. And I was reflecting on how much these messages of, all of them are really very much in line with the teachings in this tradition. And been also reflecting on how that was a kind of a salve for the troubles of these times, that there seems to be so much activation and energy and one thing after another, natural disasters followed by human disasters. It's this sort of like exhausting cycle. And, it feels especially bad to me in this moment, at least in my lifetime of being conscious. But then I was talking to someone the other day whose father-in-law was in a concentration camp in World War II. Was talking about how Europe was on fire and that he witnessed sort of unspeakable tragedies. And then I was reflecting on my own history of my grandparents' time when, during the partition of India, 2 million people died and 14 million people were displaced. And it just seems to go on and on and on, that we are in a kind of human-made cycle of these kinds of things. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha gave a famous sermon where he said the world is on fire. And that remains true today, both figuratively and literally. And sometimes I feel like, in spiritual communities, there can be a tendency to kind of bypass these realities, even though the seminal teaching in Buddhism is the truth of suffering, that, we sometimes people sitting in my seat here will use terms like it's empty or it's impersonal, or we talk about relative truth and absolute truth, which are useful ideas and understandings, but not when they deny the very real reality of suffering. Which reminds me of some words from Leonard Cohen. He says, "I know the burden's heavy as you will it through the night. the guru says it's empty, but it doesn't mean it's light. So where do we find shelter, security, safety, some sense of ease? What the Buddha famously called refuge. Which is also something that is very much on my mind, that it's not just people who are so desperate that they would leave their homes and walk 2,000 miles in search of safety, that it's all of us in some way. All of us seeking refuge, we're all refugees, looking for some stability of ground in which to stand. It occurred to me the other day that another word for refuge is asylum. And we're all seeking some kind of asylum. And the places we often look for this refuge, distraction is probably the favorite of the moment. And it's just shocking how many ways there are to distract ourselves in this day and age. I have some friends who are into video games, and that's just like a time suck. Just hours, days go by. I'm also guilty of the occasional Netflix binge. Materialism, consumerism, workaholism. This is kind of a new one that I find a lot of people. Informationism. Like sort of this idea that if I could get more facts or more information or more news, that somehow I could make sense of all this and it would make me feel better. Foods, drugs, alcohol. It's shocking that 72,000 people died of opiate overdoses last year. And people turn to those things, when they have suffering that is not somehow eased. And so some of these kinds of refuges, we call them false refuges, they can provide a kind of temporary band-aid, but the relief they promise is actually quite flimsy. There's this idea in Buddhist philosophy of samsara. The word samsara means wandering, and it's often used sort of in contrast with the term nirvana, that this sense of human existence is that we're just sort of wandering around, often repeating the same patterns again and again. It could be like we're in a desert, just moving in circles and only finding mirages and not actually getting the nourishment of a true spring. So the Buddha spoke about what he called reliable refuges, places that we can put our trust, that are worthy of our trust. The first is called refuge in the Buddha. And sometimes people take this very literally to mean, a person who might have lived 2,500 years ago, who figured out some things and inspired a lot of people, and he was actually a great kind of a social justice warrior of the time. He would talk to kings and discourage them from being at war, and he would talk to monks and later nuns about how to keep harmony in the community. And they called the Buddha and his follower the happy ones, because this practice of meditation and this practice of doing good in the world makes one happy. The way I usually look at this concept of refuge in the Buddha is the potentiality that each of us have to awaken to not only the truth of how it is in the world, that things are impermanent and fleeting, that there is some measure of suffering in every human existence, and that it's all empty. That we can connect in some deeper way with our true nature, who we really are, this luminous heart, this heart that at its core is open and vast and free and filled with qualities of kindness and love and compassion, that is stable and can be unaffected by the winds of the world, that we've just forgotten how to access this quality of our being. When that there's a possibility to have a calm and pleasant abiding. This was the term the Buddha used, a calm and pleasant abiding, no matter what's happening in the external world. There's a line from a sutta that I like. It's called the Mangala Sutta. It's Deva comes down from the heavens and asks the Buddha, what are the highest blessings? And it's a beautiful thing, actually, to memorize and remind yourself what's important. But there's a line in that says, although involved in worldly ways, unshaken the mind remains, beyond all sorrow, spotless, secure. So this refuge in Buddha is the idea that each of us have this potential within us, that we can connect with a kind of penetrating wisdom that knows, kind of informs how we are in our being and how we can act in ways that are supportive of ourselves and others, and the way in which we can be a sanctuary for others when we have this embodiment, when we have this quality of peace, this quality of love in our hearts. Over the last few years, I've become very interested in some teachers who do a Mahayana practice, which involves bowing and prostration. And it's come a long road for me to come to that, because the religion of my origin is Sikhism, and it's all devotion. And I never connected with the idea of, bowing down, or that just didn't have any. In fact, I rebelled against that idea for a long time. But in coming full circle to this practice of bowing and prostration, it's so interesting. Like, on the one hand, I think the sages that came up with these practices a long time ago, were probably yogis, and so there's a kind of energetic balancing that seems to happen when you go from standing upright to putting your head on the floor. A friend of mine did a year retreat in the Tibetan tradition where this is one of their practices, but they're kind of goal-oriented. So in the year of his silent retreat, he had to do 100,000 prostrations. And you get really buff. It's kind of like and so in the practice that I've been doing, there's chanting, and you invoke the name of Kuan Yin. This is the Bodhisattva of compassion. This archetype appears in very different forms throughout different Buddhist traditions, and even some in the Hindu tradition. Sometimes this form is a male, sometimes it's female. I've heard it said that there are 32 different manifestations of this energy, each for a different mind's disposition. Sometimes you'll see her in the form of Tara, and Tara is known for the royal posture of ease. And that posture of ease usually has one leg that's like this. And the idea is that she's ready to spring into action at any moment to tend to whatever needs tending in the world. There's another archetype of this energy called Avalokiteshvara. And she is often depicted as having 1,000 arms, and each hand has some instrument of healing. It's either an eye to know, to be able to see what needs to be done, or medicine. Sometimes it's a lotus flower, the symbol of enlightenment. Sometimes it's a sword to cut through the bonds that tie us. And this name Kuan Yin literally means one who listens to the cries of the world. And there's a sense that, she listens to the cries of the world with ease, and then has the ground to act in a way that's wise and supportive and helpful. And so in doing this practice of invoking the name of Kuan Yin and bowing, literally connecting the head with the earth in the same way that the Buddha famously, on the day of his enlightenment, touched the earth to bear witness to his right to claim his enlightenment. And then the sense that, I'm not really bowing down to some goddess or some deity or some image, but really connecting with the part of this heart that can listen to the cries of the world with ease. And then know what needs to be done and do it skillfully. And when we do this, even in moments, it's very joyful. It's a cause for joy, despite everything that's happening in the world. So that's the first refuge. The second refuge is refuge in the Dharma. The word Dharma really means the truth of how things are, the natural laws that govern the universe and govern our human existence. This set of wisdom teachings that have been passed down mostly person by person for thousands of years. The path of practice that can point us to the liberative aspect of Buddha nature, the strategies or tools or practices that we engage in to realize that. So there was a Zen monk in 10th century China, a famous monk, Yuman, and he was considered to be, very wise and learned, and one of his students came to him and said, what is the highest, most profound teaching of all the Buddhas and all the patriarchs? I love these stories where, the vast volume, like the Pali Canon alone is bookshelf upon bookshelf, and someone just tries to distill this into one really pithy, bumper sticker phrase. You ready? The most profound teaching of all the Buddhas and all the patriarchs is an appropriate response. This notion of an appropriate response that we might say is skillful or wise or forward-leading, that it leads to liberation in some sense, that it maximizes well-being and minimizes suffering for ourselves and others. That the path is really laying the groundwork for us to be able to inhabit that space of generating an appropriate response. And this is intimately connected to what the Buddha called karma, or in the Pali it's kama, which is used quite differently in this tradition than we use the word colloquially. In Buddhism, karma means action. We often talk about karma as the result in common English, but in Buddhism, karma is action. It's intentional action. It's action of body, action of speech, and even action of mind. And because it's intentional action, you can see that how we respond, the responses that we manifest in the world, are intimately tied to the intentions that we hold. From a text called the Samyutta Nikaya, according to the seed that's sown, sow the fruit you will reap therefrom. Doer of good will gather good. Doer of evil, evil reaps. Down is the seed, and thou shalt taste the fruit thereof. So if you plant mango seeds, and the conditions are supportive, the soil is the right soil, and the nutrients and the earthworms and the microbial activity in the soil and the sun and the rain are just right. So many things actually have to go right. Then we get a mango tree. We know for certain that we won't get an apple tree. That's probably the only thing we know for certain. So in the external world, there's this tendency that what we sow is what we reap, but it depends on so many other things. You can be, a really loving and kind person, and someone can still punch you out or rob you or cheat you. Like, we just don't. There's no guarantees. But still, we could shift the odds in our favor. But in the inner world, the relationship between action, thought, intention is much more direct. There's a kind of instant karma, which is not what you see on YouTube, where someone does something obnoxious and they get their comeuppance. It's more the sense that, when you act out of ill will or aversion, you can feel it in the body. It's like anger is like a stress response. All the cortisol and adrenaline and all these hormones are coursing, and it's painful in that moment, and maybe for many moments thereafter. And when we act out of generosity or kindness or love, it's actually the opposite. The healing hormones like oxytocin, and it's the opposite of suffering. When we're stuck in this, pattern of always craving what's pleasant and always wanting to push away what's unpleasant and being caught up and identified with whatever thoughts just appear in the mind, or taking birth and identity in them, in that moment of those actions we suffer. And we strengthen that way of relating to our experience. And one of the things about the mind, and we know this about the brain from neuroscience, is that it's always practicing something. However we engage the mind, it becomes really good at that pattern of activity. So what do we want to be practicing? So while the notion of karma, on the one hand, seems to be kind of forward-looking, on the other hand, it's really pointing to the possibility of choice in this moment. The mindfulness that we cultivate can give us a space between stimulus and response. And in that space, we have a choice. We can react in habitual patterns, or we can react in patterns that are more skillful and more wise. To kind of hold close what your deepest intentions are, and in that moment of choice, measure them. Is this the kind of person I want to be, or are these the kind of values I want to express in my conduct? In current parlance, we'll often talk about karma as a cause of something, like, oh, such bad karma that this happened, or sometimes we might wonder, what is my karma that this bad thing happened to me? And the Buddha in his teachings on this was very clear that, not all things depend on karma, because karma is only the set of intentional acts of body, speech, and mind. And that's not a small thing, like to have some measure of control over what we actually can control. But then there's so many other things outside our control: illness, accidents, weather. It was also quite clear in the teachings that it is unfruitful to try to figure out what past karma created the present situation. Actually, this is called one of the imponderables. And it said that it would drive one mad and lead to vexation. It's the translation of that. There's a t-shirt I saw actually that said, welcome to Cafe Karma. There's no menu, you just get what you deserve. Tell a joke and get the feedback. So I think sometimes this notion of karma is kind of misunderstood as some sort of like cosmic justice system where everybody gets their just dessert. You know, that's comforting, actually, in a way, to think that that's the case. And some of the teachings about rebirth and what realm you will be reborn in have that flavor of, like, you'll get what's coming. But this isn't really the spirit of the teachings. You know, there's not really a concept of being punished for your sins. It's more like your sins themselves are the punishment. It's also helpful to be aware that we swim in karmic streams, that our own karma, our own thoughts, our own actions affect those that are around us in this imponderable flow of interactivity. The image that is sometimes used is if there was a duck on a very still lake and you were to throw a pebble into the pond, the pebble would cause ripples, and the duck would respond to those ripples. Very clear cause and effect. But if thousands of pebbles were being thrown into the pond, ripples would cancel each other out, some of them would amplify, they'd be moving in every kind of direction, and the duck would still respond. But it'd be very difficult to say, you know, which pebble caused the response. In fact, we might even say all the pebbles caused the response. And, you know, we're profoundly social animals. Our intentions and motivations are often rooted in our family, our culture, our tribe. The motivation to fit in and belong is incredibly powerful. And we can see the beautiful ways in which this plays out in spaces like this, and then we can see the scary ways in which this plays out in society. And sometimes this teaching of karma can be misunderstood in another way, which is to sort of like beat ourselves over the head when we behave unskillfully. And this is where the mindfulness practice, you know, pays dividends, that moment of self-flagellation is a very important moment to examine, to see that these patterns are very deeply rooted, and that's why we call this a practice, because we're reprogramming these habitual behaviors breath by breath, moment by moment. There's a story that the Buddha, after his awakening, would frequently be visited by Mara. Mara is the sort of embodiment of delusion and fear and all the things that hinder and obstruct our development. And in the stories, you know, Mara's kind of like a little character. And so he'd show up and he'd whisper in the Buddha's ear, you know, you're not really enlightened, right? And the Buddha would just say, I know you, Mara. And then in some of the stories, Mara would just vanish. And other moments, he would sort of like, this image of like slinking away, kind of like embarrassedly. And Mara would come back and say something like, you know, you've done such a good job with all these difficult people. Maybe you should just take a vacation, take it easy, enjoy yourself. And the Buddha would just say, I know you, Mara. And then Mara would vanish. What I love about that is that, he didn't have to kick him or like kill him or shoot him with an arrow or destroy him. They just had to know him. And this is really, this happened for about 7 years, they say, and then at one point Mara realized, oh well, he knows me, so no point in bothering him. And this is what can happen in our mindfulness practice. Like, we have this notion of like there's so much to do or that we have to overcome, and sometimes there's just incredible power in awareness, that when we bring something into awareness, when we know it, that there is a kind of inner wisdom that can take care of all the details. That the mind and the heart naturally want to be in a kind of equilibrium. So the third refuge is that of Sangha, the community of like-minded travelers on the path. And the Buddha famously said that the spiritual friendship was the whole of the holy life. Just really hard to do this alone. I mean, we all know, just even on a superficial level, that it's much easier to meditate in a group. We're not really doing each other, just our presence somehow makes it easier to settle. And so much of this practice is to remember. Like, we know all these things. We know that when we have kindness in our heart, things are better. And we know when we forbear from doing something that might feel good in the moment and have negative repercussions. We know the power of presence, and yet we forget. This is the dilemma, that we forget. And so to have a community where we can remind each other, we can remind each other with kind words, we can remind each other just by our quality of being. By responding appropriately to our spiritual friends, we can invite our own appropriate response. And so for me, this idea of refuge is also really connected to some idea of surrender. There's so much happening right now that is mostly outside my control, that I can actually let go of some of this struggle, the desperate wanting everything to be different. The peril of the meditator is the desire to use sort of like Dharma gung fu to like make everything okay, moment by moment. This surrender is just the idea that we can just rest, that there is innate goodness in humanity, even if it's covered over at this moment, and that all we need to do is tend to our own path of practice, paying attention to how we relate to ourselves and each other. So I'll end with this reading. This is from Mark Morford. He's a journalist with the San Francisco Chronicle. He says, "Stop thinking this is all there is. Realize that for every ongoing war and religious outrage and environmental devastation and bogus attack plan, there are 1,000 million counterbalancing acts of staggering generosity and humanity and art and beauty happening all over the world right now on a breathtaking scale from flower box to cathedral. Resist the temptation to drown in fatalism, to shake your head and sigh and throw in the karmic towel. Realize that this is the perfect moment to change the energy of the world. To step right up and crank your personal volume right when it seems dark and bitter and offensive and acrimonious and conflicted and bilious. This is your opening. Remember magic. And finally, believe that you are part of a groundswell, a resistance, a seemingly small but actually very, very large impending karmic overhaul, a great shift, the beginning of something important and potent and unstoppable. Well, thank you for your kind attention.